The truth hit Cora Carter like a bucket of cold, well water thrown straight into her face on a blazing August afternoon. She had been standing inside the Dusty Creek General Store, her traveling dress still carrying the red dust of a 2-day stagecoach ride from Abilene, her dark hair escaping its pins in wild, exhausted tendrils, when she overheard two women talking just on the other side of a shelf stacked with bolts of calico fabric. Their voices were low, conspiratorial, threaded through with that particular brand of small-town relish that comes from people who have very little happening in their lives and therefore treat every scrap of gossip like precious gold ore. "He asked old Henry Marsh about the stage schedule twice," the first voice said, and Cora recognized it as belonging to the postmistress, a wide woman named Dottie Pringle who had already looked Cora over with such naked curiosity upon her arrival that Cora had felt like a prized heifer at auction. "Twice, mind you. Once on Monday and once again on Thursday. You know Isaac Abbott never asks about anything twice. That man barely speaks enough words in a day to fill a thimble." "Lord above," the second woman breathed. It was a younger voice, breathless with delight. "Do you think he knew she was coming?" "Knew she was coming." Dottie Pringle let out a sound that was half laugh and half scandal. "Honey, I think he was counting the hours." Cora stood absolutely still between the shelves. The tin of baking powder she had reached for was suspended in her hand, forgotten entirely. A strange sensation moved through her chest, not quite warmth and not quite dread, but something caught precisely between the two, like a compass needle spinning and unable to find north. Nobody had told her. Not a single soul in the entire town of Dusty Creek, Texas, had seen fit to mention to Cora Carter, who had arrived on the afternoon stage with 2 battered trunks, a letter of employment tucked into her bodice, and absolutely no illusions about the hardness of frontier life, that the quiet rancher who owned the largest spread of land in the county had been quietly, deliberately, twice over, asking about when she would arrive. She set the baking powder back on the shelf with a careful, controlled click. She straightened her back. She walked out of the general store and into the blinding white light of the Texas summer, and she stood on the wooden boardwalk and stared across the dusty Main Street at absolutely nothing, trying to reorganize everything she thought she knew about the situation she had walked herself directly into. She had come to Dusty Creek for a job. That was the simple and unromantic truth of it. She had answered an advertisement in the Abilene Chronicle, placed by a ranching operation called Abbott Cattle Company, seeking a schoolteacher for the small schoolhouse that served the ranching families of the surrounding area. The salary was modest but fair. The position included boarding arrangements. The letter she had received in response to her application had been brief to the point of terseness, signed with a name, Isaac Abbott, in handwriting that was careful and precise, and somehow communicated both extreme competence and extreme restraint in equal measure. She had not expected to feel anything about Isaac Abbott before she even met him. She had certainly not expected to feel this peculiar, breathless, unsettling thing that was currently happening somewhere in the region of her sternum. 3 weeks earlier, before any of this had begun, Cora Carter had been sitting in the tiny, airless apartment above the dress shop where she worked in Abilene, Kansas, reading the employment notices in the newspaper by the light of a single oil lamp. She was 26 years old, which the women of Abilene generally considered to be past the natural marrying age, a fact they communicated to Cora through a complex system of pitying looks and well-meaning suggestions. She had been engaged once to a banker's son named Gerald Whitmore, who had turned out to have both a gambling debt of catastrophic proportions and a secondary fiancé in Wichita. That particular betrayal had been educational, if nothing else. Cora had emerged from it with a clear-eyed understanding of her own ability to survive disappointment and a firm private resolution to never again mistake a man's confident exterior for reliable interior character. She had savings enough to keep herself for perhaps 4 months if she was careful. The dress shop was closing. Her options were limited. The advertisement for a schoolteacher in Dusty Creek, Texas, had offered better money than anything else she had found, and the letter she had received from one Isaac Abbott had been the most direct and honest piece of correspondence she had ever received from a potential employer, free of flattery, free of promises he could not keep, containing only the plain facts of the position and a question about whether she had experience teaching children of mixed ages and abilities. She had written back that she had, which was the truth. She had been helping her mother run a small school in their farmhouse for the children of neighboring families since she was 17. She knew how to teach. She was good at it. She liked it. It was one of the few things in her life that had never let her down. She had packed her trunks, sold what she could not carry, said goodbye to the 2 friends she had in Abilene, and boarded the stage south. And now she was standing on a boardwalk in Dusty Creek with the August sun beating down on the crown of her head, knowing something she had not known an hour ago, and trying very hard to decide what to do about it. The sound of a horse approaching pulled her attention back to the present. She looked up to see a man riding down the center of the main street on a dark bay gelding with the kind of unhurried, purposeful gait that matched its rider perfectly. The man was perhaps 30 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the way that comes from actual physical work rather than any deliberate effort, wearing a plain cotton work shirt the color of a cloudy sky and a hat that had clearly seen several years of serious use. His face, what she could see of it beneath the hat brim, was angular and composed, carrying the particular quality of stillness she associated with people who had learned to be very careful about what they allowed to show. He pulled the horse to a stop in front of the general store and swung down with the easy economy of movement that speaks to a man who has spent so much of his life on horseback that the getting on and off is as unconscious as breathing. He looped the reins over the hitching post. He straightened, and then he looked up and he saw her. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt considerably longer. His eyes were dark. She could see that much from where she stood, and there was something in the way they went briefly still when they found her face, some fractional pause, some barely perceptible catch in his composure, that told her what she needed to know even before he crossed the street toward her with deliberate, measured steps. "Miss Carter," he said, when he was close enough that she could see the careful control in his expression and the slight tension around his jaw that suggested the control was costing him something. "I'm Isaac Abbott. Welcome to Dusty Creek." His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that did not waste itself on unnecessary volume, and Cora thought about Dottie Pringle's assessment, that this man barely fills a thimble with his daily words, and she understood immediately that this was both accurate and deeply misleading, because there was more contained in Isaac Abbott's 3 sentences of greeting than most men put into 30 minutes of talking. "Mr. Abbott," she said, and shook his extended hand, and noted that his grip was firm and brief and respectful, and that his eyes, which were indeed very dark brown, did not look away from her face with the flickering calculation she was accustomed to seeing from men who were weighing her up as a commodity. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he finds genuinely interesting, not possessively, with a kind of serious attention that made her feel, strangely, both seen and safe. "The boarding house is arranged," he said. "Mrs. Gallagher on Oak Street. She's a decent woman and the house is clean. I can take your trunks over now if you've collected them from the stage office." "I have," Cora said. "Thank you." He nodded once, which she was beginning to understand was his equivalent of an entire paragraph of response. He went to the stage office, collected both her trunks with no apparent effort and no apparent need for assistance, loaded them into the back of a wagon she had not noticed parked beside the general store, and drove her the 3 blocks to Mrs. Gallagher's boarding house. And in the entire span of this activity, he spoke perhaps 4 additional sentences, all of them practical and useful. Cora found, to her considerable surprise, that she did not find the silence uncomfortable. She found it restful. After 2 days on a stagecoach with 5 other passengers, 2 of whom had held competing and loudly expressed opinions about the Transcontinental Railroad, quiet was a luxury. Mrs. Gallagher turned out to be a compact, energetic woman of approximately 60 with sharp eyes, and an immediately apparent inclination to mother anyone within reach. She showed Cora to a clean, pleasant room with a window overlooking a small yard where 3 chickens moved with profound dignity between patches of dust. She told Cora about the town, about the other families whose children would be in the school, about the social calendar, and about Isaac Abbott, this last subject covered with such careful neutrality of tone that it was obvious Mrs. Gallagher had several firm opinions about him that she was deliberately keeping locked away. Cora did not ask about the stage inquiries. She had decided, in the 3 minutes between overhearing Dottie Pringle and meeting Isaac Abbott in the street, that she was not going to let that knowledge change her behavior or her expectations. She was here for a job. She needed the work. She needed the salary. She was not going to allow herself to read significance into second-hand gossip about a man she had known for 11 minutes. She was, however, going to pay attention. The school was a single-room building at the edge of town, well-built and clean, with 8 wooden desks of varying sizes, a decent slate board, and a small library of primers and readers that someone had assembled with genuine care. Isaac Abbott, she learned from Mrs. Gallagher, had paid for the building himself and had spent 3 Saturdays collecting the books from various sources. He had done this, Mrs. Gallagher mentioned with that same careful neutrality, because the children of the ranch hands who worked his land had no other access to education, and he believed that was wrong. This information settled into Cora's chest and stayed there. She spent her first full day in Dusty Creek walking through the school, taking inventory of supplies, writing lists of what was needed, planning her teaching schedule. She was interrupted mid-afternoon by the arrival of a small boy of approximately 7 years who appeared in the doorway, regarded her with enormous solemn eyes, and announced without preamble that his name was Bobby Marsh, and that he had heard there was a new teacher, and he wanted to see what she looked like. Cora told him that she looked exactly as he saw her, and invited him to sit at one of the desks while she finished her list. Bobby Marsh sat at the desk and swung his feet, which did not reach the floor, and asked her approximately 37 questions in the span of 20 minutes, including whether she had ever seen a rattlesnake, whether she could whistle, and whether it was true that a person's hair turned white if they were frightened badly enough. She had seen a rattlesnake. She could whistle. She told him the hair-turning question was more complicated than a simple yes or no. Bobby Marsh decided on the basis of this assessment that she was satisfactory, and informed her that his father was the stage manager, Henry Marsh, and that she should come to dinner at their house on Sunday if she did not have other plans. Cora thanked him and said she would consider it. Bobby Marsh nodded with the gravity of someone who has successfully conducted an important piece of business and departed. Cora sat alone in the schoolhouse and found herself smiling at the empty doorway for a solid minute before she caught herself. She saw Isaac Abbott on Thursday, 4 days after her arrival, when he came to the schoolhouse to ask if she had everything she needed before the school session opened the following Monday. He stood in the doorway of the schoolroom with his hat in his hands, his dark eyes moving over the space with a quiet assessment that took in the rearranged desks, the books organized by level on the shelf, the clean slate board, and the small vase of wildflowers she had put on her own desk because she liked color and light in her working environment. Something shifted in his expression when he saw the wildflowers. It was small, barely detectable, a slight softening, but Cora saw it because she had been, as she had promised herself, paying attention. "Everything is in order," she told him. "I'll need chalk, more of it than what's here, and I'd like to add a few more titles to the library if the budget allows." "Make a list," he said. "I'll see to it." She handed him a list she had already written because she had anticipated this conversation and believed in being prepared. His mouth did almost nothing at all, but she thought, very briefly, that it wanted to curve upward, and this restrained almost smile was somehow more affecting than any broad grin would have been. "Miss Carter," he said, after a pause in which she could not tell what he was thinking, "the Hendersons and the Marshes are having a gathering on Saturday evening, a supper mostly and some music. You'd be welcome if you'd care to come. It would give you a chance to meet the families before Monday." It was the most words he had strung together in either of their two interactions. Cora recognized the effort and did not allow herself to make anything of it. "That sounds very useful," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once, put on his hat, left. Cora stood in the middle of the schoolroom for a full minute after the sound of his horse had faded, her hand resting on the surface of her desk, and her thoughts doing something complicated and unruly, that she told them firmly to stop. The Saturday gathering was held at the Henderson Ranch, a prosperous spread about 2 miles outside of town. Cora rode out in the wagon with Mrs. Gallagher, who spent the entire journey providing her with detailed intelligence about every family she was about to meet. The Henderson family had 4 children, the eldest being a girl of 14 named Alice, who was apparently the most competent young person in the county. The Marsh family she already knew from Bobby. There were also the Ramos family, whose father Ernesto worked as Isaac Abbott's foreman and whose 3 children were among the brightest in the district. Mrs. Gallagher said this last piece of information with a directness that Cora appreciated, since she was aware that not everyone in 1883 Texas would have led with that assessment, and it told her something important about the character of the community she had entered. The supper was cheerful and loud and extraordinarily generous, the way frontier gatherings tend to be when people who have worked hard and live far apart finally get to sit together and eat. There were long tables set up in the Henderson yard, lit with lanterns, and the food was the kind that comes from people who take genuine pride in feeding others. Cora met everyone, remembered most names, and felt, for the first time since leaving Abilene, that she had perhaps made a reasonable decision. Isaac Abbott arrived late, coming directly from the range by the look of him, having made some effort to clean up but not quite achieving the standards of a formal occasion, and apparently unbothered by this. He settled at the far end of the table near Ernesto Ramos and his wife Consuela, and he spoke in his customary measured way, but he laughed twice during the course of the evening, a low, genuine sound that Cora heard from across the table and felt somewhere in her ribcage, which was inconvenient. After supper there was music, a fiddle played by a ranch hand named Pete with great enthusiasm and moderate skill, and people danced in the dirt yard under the lanterns. Cora watched from the edge of the gathering and thought about how completely different this was from anything she had known in Abilene and how unexpectedly right it felt, and she was in the middle of this thought when Isaac Abbott appeared at her side. He did not ask her to dance. He stood beside her and watched the dancing in silence for a moment and then said, quietly, "You seem comfortable here." "More than I expected," she admitted. He was quiet again. "Then, where were you before Abilene?" "A farm outside of Lawrence, Kansas," she said. "My father's land. He died 2 years ago and my mother last winter. I stayed to settle the affairs and then I needed to find a different kind of life." She did not know why she told him all of that. She had said more in those 4 sentences than she had planned to say to any employer about her personal history, but his question had been genuine and direct, not probing or curious in a prurient way, and it had seemed dishonest to give him less than the truth. He turned to look at her then, not a glance, a real look, the kind that takes a moment and gives something back. "I lost my father when I was 19, he said. "This land was a quarter of what it is now. There were 6 months I didn't know if I could keep it." "But you did," she said. "But I did," he agreed. The fiddle changed to a slower tune. The lantern light moved in the faint breeze. Cora was very aware of how close they were standing, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm without extending her reach, and she was also very aware that she was standing still, not stepping away, which said something she was not yet ready to examine directly. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said, without any qualification or hesitation, which she found was the most honest possible answer. "Did you know I was coming before I arrived?" The pause this produced was brief but real, and in it she saw the slight straightening of his already straight posture and the controlled stillness of his expression doing a bit more work than usual. "I knew the stage schedule," he said, which was not quite the same as answering the question. "That's not what I asked," she said, keeping her voice entirely gentle so it would not sound like an accusation. Another pause. In the lantern light, his profile was serious and clean-lined, and Cora watched him decide something. "I asked Henry Marsh when the stage was coming in," he said. "Twice, once on Monday and once on Thursday." "Why twice?" she asked. The pause before his answer was the longest yet. "Because the first answer didn't satisfy me," he said. Cora looked at the dancers, not because she needed to, but because she needed a moment that was not occupied by his eyes on her face. "And what does the second answer tell you about yourself?" she asked. She heard him exhale, something close to a laugh but quieter, more internal. "Probably something I already knew," he said. They stood together in the lantern-lit dark and did not speak for a while longer, and the silence was not empty. It was the kind of silence that is so full of unsaid things that it has its own weight and texture, and Cora felt it pressing against her with a warmth she did not entirely resist. School opened on Monday morning with 14 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, and Cora discovered within the first hour that she had been entirely right to look forward to this work. The children were smart, curious, and varied in their backgrounds in ways that she found stimulating rather than challenging. Alice Henderson was exactly as competent as advertised, and also clearly starved for academic challenge. So Cora set her extra reading on the first day. Bobby Marsh asked 4 questions that had nothing whatsoever to do with the lesson but were excellent questions regardless. The Ramos children, Louis, Marta, and small Tomas, were quietly brilliant in a way that rewarded patience, and Cora had patience in abundance. She settled into a rhythm. She was good at her work, and the work absorbed her in the best possible way, using the whole of her intelligence and energy and leaving her pleasantly tired at day's end. She ate supper with Mrs. Gallagher, who was an excellent cook and an excellent companion who was simultaneously willing to talk and to be quiet, both rare qualities. She wrote letters home to her 2 Abilene friends, Dorothy and me, who were delighted by her frontier reports, and responded with news of Abilene that was increasingly irrelevant to her new life. She saw Isaac Abbott on Tuesdays, when he rode into town to conduct his business at the bank and the feed store and the general store. She began to understand that he came to town on Tuesdays and only Tuesdays, and that she had begun, without making any conscious decision about it, to look out the schoolhouse window at a particular point in the afternoon when he customarily rode past. She told herself this was simply the natural interest of someone new to a community and the people around her. She did not entirely believe herself. 3 weeks into her time in Dusty Creek, a letter arrived from Abilene that complicated everything. The letter was from Gerald Whitmore, the banker's son who had been her fiancé before she discovered his gambling debts and his Wichita entanglement. He had somehow obtained her address, which meant that either Dorothy or me had made a significant error in judgment, or he had found it through some other means that did not bear comfortable thinking about. The letter was lengthy and exquisitely written, which had always been Gerald's particular skill, the ability to arrange words into sequences so beautiful and compelling that you finished reading them before you noticed they had said nothing of substance. He told her he had changed. He told her the debts were settled. He told her the other woman had meant nothing, had been a mistake born of weakness and fear, had been ended completely. He told her he had never stopped loving her. He asked her to come back. Cora sat at the desk in her boarding house room and read the letter twice, and then sat with it in her hands for a long time. The betrayal she had felt 2 years ago when she discovered the truth about Gerald had been one of the formative experiences of her adult life. Not because she had been devastated, exactly, though there had been real pain in it. More because it had taught her something specific and uncomfortable about herself, which was that she had seen the signs and chosen not to look at them, because looking would have required her to act, and acting would have meant disrupting the comfortable certainty of having a plan for her life. She had been engaged to Gerald Whitmore primarily because being engaged to him had felt like a resolved question, a settled matter, a safe harbor. She had not been engaged to him because she loved him in any way that felt like the way she thought love ought to feel, which she had come to believe involved a kind of helpless recognition, a sense of meeting something in another person that you did not know you were looking for until you found it. She folded the letter. She put it in the drawer beside her Bible. She thought about Isaac Abbott standing beside her under the lanterns, asking where she had been before Abilene and the particular quality of his silence, and the way he had admitted, with such careful and reluctant honesty, that he had asked about the stage schedule twice. She did not write back to Gerald. The following Tuesday, instead of looking out the schoolhouse window when Isaac Abbott rode past, she walked to the door and said good afternoon, which was so different from her previous behavior that he pulled his horse to a complete halt and looked at her with his dark, serious eyes carrying a question. "Are you free on Saturday?" she asked, and her voice was steady because she had decided to be direct and directness required commitment. He blinked once. "What did you have in mind?" "I would like to see the range," she said. "If that's something you'd be willing to show me. I've been in this town for 3 weeks and I've seen the school and the main street and Mrs. Gallagher's yard, and I would like to see the land that everyone talks about as though it were the actual beginning and end of the world." Something happened in his expression then, something that moved through it too quickly to name, but that left everything after it slightly different, slightly warmer, slightly less controlled. "Saturday morning," he said. "I'll have a horse for you." He rode on. Cora went back into the school and spent the next 15 minutes being thoroughly unable to concentrate on lesson planning, which was so unlike her that it was itself a piece of information. Saturday morning arrived with the particular clarity that Texas mornings can achieve in early September, when the worst of the summer heat has started to ease, and the sky has a depth to it that makes distances look both farther and more beautiful than they really are. Isaac Abbott arrived at Mrs. Gallagher's gate at precisely 7 in the morning with 2 horses saddled and ready, a light bay mare for Cora and his own dark gelding, and Mrs. Gallagher watched their departure from the front window with an expression that she attempted to make neutral and failed. They rode out of town and onto the open range, and Cora understood within the first 10 minutes why people talked about this land the way they did. It was enormous and particular and beautiful in a way that demanded acknowledgement, not the soft green beauty of Kansas farmland, which was beautiful too, but in a quieter, more domestic way, but something vast and self-sufficient that made you feel simultaneously very small and very alive. The grasses moved in the morning wind, and the sky arched overhead in a blue so deep it was almost architectural, and in every direction the distance stretched to a horizon that seemed to promise something beyond itself. Isaac Abbott rode beside her and named things: the creek that crossed the north pasture and ran year-round even in drought years, the ridge where the cattle liked to shelter in winter, the section he had been planning to fence for 3 years and had not yet fenced. He spoke about the land with a particular kind of love, practical and specific, the love of someone who has invested not just money and labor but something more essential in a thing. Cora listened and asked questions, and he answered them fully, and she realized that the terse economy of his speech in social situations was not the whole of him. Given a subject he cared about, he could talk, not extensively, not like a man who loved the sound of his own voice, but with a precision and warmth that told you more in 10 sentences than most people managed in 50. She told him about the farm in Kansas, about teaching her neighbors' children in the farmhouse parlor, about her father, who had been a quiet man of absolute integrity who worked his land as though it owed him nothing and gave everything he could back to it, and who had died of a fever at 61 with, she believed, very few regrets. Isaac Abbott listened to this without interrupting and without the slight inattentiveness that she was accustomed to encountering when she talked, the sense that the other person was waiting for the end of her sentence so they could begin theirs. He was actually listening. The distinction felt significant. They stopped at the creek at mid-morning and let the horses drink, and Isaac Abbott produced from his saddlebag a cloth-wrapped packet that turned out to be cornbread and hard cheese and dried apple slices, which Mrs. Gallagher had clearly packed for them, because Mrs. Gallagher believed that all human situations were improved by the provision of food. They sat on the bank of the creek and ate and watched the water and a pair of scissor-tailed flycatchers working the air above the opposite bank. "Can I ask you something?" Isaac said. "Yes," she said, using his own answer back at him, and watched his mouth do the almost smile. "Why did you come here?" he said. "Not the schoolteacher job. That's the practical answer. I mean the real reason. Most teachers we get are men and they stay for 6 months and then leave for somewhere with better prospects." "You aren't going to do that." "How do you know?" she asked. "Because of how you arrange the school," he said. "People who are planning to leave don't put wildflowers on their desk." Cora looked at the creek for a moment. "I came because I needed something real," she said. "I had a life in Abilene that was very neat and sensible and arranged according to other people's ideas of what a life should look like, and it turned out to be mostly performance. I want something that matters. I want to do work that means something. I want to be somewhere I can actually see the difference I'm making." "The children matter," he said, not a reassurance, a statement of fact. "Yes," she said. "They do." He was quiet, turning a piece of dried apple between his fingers. "I almost sold the ranch," he said after a while, 2 years ago. A man from a land company in Austin came and made an offer. It was a fair price, more than fair. I sat with it for 2 weeks. He paused. "I couldn't do it. This land is the thing I know how to take care of, the thing I'm good at taking care of. Selling it would have been like selling the part of myself that knows what it's for." Cora was looking at him. He was looking at the creek, his profile clean and still in the morning light, and she felt the thing in her chest that she had been refusing to name since the lantern-lit Saturday at the Henderson Ranch, and she thought, well, there it is. There it actually is. She did not say anything. It was too early for saying, and she respected him too much to rush what was clearly worth patience. They rode back to town in the late morning, and the ride back was different from the ride out, not in anything either of them said or did, but in some fundamental atmospheric quality that had shifted, as though a pressure front had passed through and left the air lighter and cleaner. At Mrs. Gallagher's gate, Isaac Abbott dismounted and held her horse's bridle while she dismounted, and for a moment they were standing very close, closer than was strictly necessary, and he looked at her with those dark, serious eyes, and whatever he was thinking he kept with characteristic care. "Thank you for this morning," she said. "Thank you for asking," he said. It was not until she was inside and had climbed the stairs to her room and sat down on the edge of her bed that she realized she was smiling in a way that was going to be very difficult to stop. The following weeks wove themselves into a pattern that Cora would later think of as the most quietly extraordinary period of her life, ordinary on the surface and absolutely incandescent underneath. She taught school Monday through Friday with complete commitment and growing skill. She had supper with Mrs. Gallagher. She attended Sunday services at the small church and had dinner afterward with whichever family had invited her, which began to be a rotating roster, because the families of Dusty Creek were warming to her with a speed and completeness that made her grateful. And on Tuesdays when Isaac rode past, and on whatever other occasion their paths crossed, she learned him. The way he was with his ranch hands, demanding and fair, the kind of employer who expected full effort and gave full respect in return. The way he was with children, which was a revelation, not comfortable exactly, not easy the way some adults are easy with children, but deeply serious, treating them as though their questions mattered and their concerns deserved real attention, which she had found that children understood and responded to with extraordinary loyalty. Bobby Marsh followed Isaac around the ranch on weekends with the devotion of a small hound, and Isaac permitted this with a solemn gravity that Bobby clearly found immensely flattering. She learned about his history, piece by piece, the way you learn a landscape you're crossing slowly on foot. His mother had died when he was 11, leaving him and his father alone on the ranch. His father had been a good man and a hard worker, but not an affectionate one, not unkind, simply from a generation that expressed care through provision rather than expression. Isaac had grown up knowing himself loved and never having it said, which she thought probably explained a good deal about him. He had been engaged once. She learned from Mrs. Gallagher, not from Isaac himself, to a girl named Catherine who had come from a family in San Antonio and had spent 6 months in Dusty Creek, and then told Isaac, gently and honestly to her credit, that she could not do it. That the land was too empty, and the town too small and the life too hard, and that she respected him too much to pretend otherwise. Isaac had reportedly received this information with complete composure and had never spoken of it to anyone. He was 31 years old and had been alone on his ranch with his books and his cattle and his quietly excellent horse for 4 years. Cora held this information carefully. She understood the specific loneliness it described, not the desperate loneliness of someone who feels themselves abandoned, but the chosen, maintained loneliness of someone who has decided it is better to be alone than to be disappointed again. She understood it because she had been living a version of it herself in Abilene for 2 years. Then Gerald Whitmore sent a second letter. This one was shorter and considerably less elegant, stripped of literary pretension into something rower and more revealing. He said he knew she had not written back. He said he assumed she was thinking. He said he was coming to Dusty Creek. He said he simply needed to see her. Cora read this letter with a cold clarity that was itself a kind of answer. The thought of Gerald Whitmore appearing in Dusty Creek felt not like the arrival of a possibility but like an intrusion, a foreign element inserting itself into something she was in the middle of building, something that mattered to her, something she did not want disturbed. She wrote back immediately. She told him clearly that she had chosen not to respond to the first letter because her answer was no. She told him that she wished him well and bore him no residual anger because both were true. She told him that coming to Dusty Creek would accomplish nothing except wasting his time and her patience. She told him not to come. She sealed the letter and gave it to Henry Marsh to send on the afternoon stage and tried to put the matter from her mind. She was not entirely successful, because a week later, on a Wednesday afternoon when she was walking back to Mrs. Gallagher's from the school, she heard hoofbeats on the main street and turned to see a figure riding in from the eastern road who was at once unfamiliar and familiar. A man in a good city suit wearing a hat that belonged in a Kansas town and not on a Texas range. And with a sinking certainty, she identified Gerald Whitmore before he had reached the hitching post. He dismounted and looked around at Dusty Creek with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere much smaller and much hotter than anticipated. And then he saw her, and his face did a complicated series of things that she recognized from their engagement. The practiced warm smile, the immediate recalibration toward charm, the impression of genuine emotion that might have been genuine emotion or might have been performance. With Gerald, she had eventually lost the ability to tell. "Cora," he said, and crossed the street toward her. "You look wonderful." "Gerald," she said, "I told you not to come." "I know you did." He stopped a few feet from her, and up close she could see that he looked tired, that there were lines in his face that hadn't been there 2 years ago, and that his suit, though good, needed a cleaning. "I needed to see you. I know that's inconvenient and I'm sorry, I just needed to." "What you need is not a consideration I'm obligated to arrange my life around," she said, and was surprised by the absence of anger in her own voice. She was not angry. She was simply resolved. "Cora, please." He lowered his voice, glancing around at the street where 2 people had definitely noticed this exchange and were making no effort to appear uninterested. "Can we talk somewhere privately?" "No," she said. There's nothing you can say that would change my answer, and saying it in private instead of public doesn't alter that. I've moved on, Gerald. I live here now. I have a job and a life, and I'm happy in a way I wasn't in Abilene, and nothing about any of that involves you." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his face that was real, real pain and real loss, and she felt compassion for it without letting it shift her resolve. "Is there someone else?" he asked. She thought about Tuesday afternoons and lantern-lit evenings and a Saturday morning on the open range. "That's not a question you have the standing to ask," she said. "Go home, Gerald. Start over somewhere. You're capable of being a decent person. Go be one." She walked away from him and went to Mrs. Gallagher's house and sat in the parlor for a while, and Mrs. Gallagher, who had seen everything from the window and pretended she hadn't, brought her a cup of tea without being asked and said absolutely nothing, which was exactly right. The trouble was that Isaac Abbott had been at the far end of the main street when this exchange took place. She did not know this until the following Tuesday when she opened the schoolhouse door and he was standing there, not riding past, standing at the door with his hat in his hands, and there was something different in his expression, a tightness, a carefully maintained composure that was working harder than usual. "Come in," she said, stepping back. He came in, looked around the room, which was empty, the children gone home an hour ago, looked at her. "The man from Wednesday," he said. "Who was he?" She had known this was coming. She had decided before she fell asleep that night exactly what she was going to say. "His name is Gerald Whitmore. We were engaged 2 years ago. He came here against my explicit request that he not come. I told him to go home." Isaac Abbott's face was very still. "Why did you break the engagement?" She met his eyes directly. "Because I discovered he had been dishonest with me about things that mattered. There was another woman in another town. There were debts he had hidden. And because I realized that even without those specific betrayals, I had never loved him in any way that I could honestly stand behind." He was quiet for a long moment. The schoolroom light was the golden afternoon light of early October, and it made the room feel warm and contained and important. "He wanted you to go back," Isaac said. "It was not a question." "Yes," she said. "And you said no, clearly and entirely," she said. He turned his hat between his hands, a motion she recognized as the physical equivalent of reaching for words. "I was concerned," he said finally, and the word was inadequate to what she could read in his face, which was more than concern, which was something she could only describe as a man standing at the edge of something large and deciding whether to step onto it. "I know," she said softly. "Isaac." His eyes came up to her face when she used his name, which she had done perhaps twice before, and always in the context of addressing him in front of others. Now it was just the two of them and the golden afternoon light, and she watched him take the thing he was feeling and examine it and refuse, for once, to fold it back into the careful, composed interior where he kept everything. "I asked Henry Marsh about the stage schedule twice," he said, "before you came. Once on Monday when I first heard a teacher had accepted the position, and once on Thursday when I couldn't stop thinking about it." He paused. "I knew that was particular. I knew what it meant. I just didn't have anything to do with that knowledge until you were here, and you turned out to be exactly as I expected." Cora felt the warmth in her chest expanding outward, reaching her face, reaching her fingertips. "How did you expect me?" she asked. "Exactly as you are," he said simply. "Real." She crossed the room and stood in front of him, close enough that she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes, and she said, "Isaac Abbott, you have been the most surprising person I have met in my entire adult life." His hand came up and touched the side of her face, the lightest possible contact, his thumb barely grazing her cheekbone, and his expression was stripped of all its careful containment. Just him, just what he felt, just this. "Cora," he said, and the way he said her name was a whole conversation's worth of things. She kissed him, or he kissed her. The distinction was unclear because they moved at exactly the same moment, as though they had been heading toward each other for the entire 7 weeks of her time in Dusty Creek and had only now arrived at the destination. It was a brief kiss, respectful and sure, and when they drew back they were both breathing slightly differently, and Isaac Abbott, who barely filled a thimble with his daily words, laughed, a low, genuine, helpless sound of surprise and delight, and Cora felt it resonate through her like a bell being struck. "I should tell you," she said, "that I plan to stay." "Good," he said, "and I should tell you that I am not a simple person to know. I have opinions about most things and I express them, and I take my work seriously and I will not be easily discouraged from it." "Good," he said again, and she could see that he meant it. "And I'm going to need considerably more bookshelves in that schoolroom before winter." The almost smile became a real one, and it transformed his face in a way that made her think she would spend a considerable portion of the rest of her life trying to make him smile like that. "I'll build them myself," he said. He did. He spent that Saturday afternoon in the schoolroom while Cora organized lesson plans at her desk, building 3 additional bookshelves out of good pine, with the focused competence she was coming to understand, was his natural mode in all things. And they talked through the afternoon about books, and about Kansas, and about the particular problems of teaching algebra to a 14-year-old girl who was bored with the textbook, but absorbed by the abstract ideas. And the afternoon was the most comfortable and complete afternoon Cora could remember spending with another person, and when he left at dusk, she stood in the doorway and watched him go and thought, "Yes, this is exactly what I came here for, even though I did not know it when I left." Gerald Whitmore had apparently taken her at her word, because he was gone from Dusty Creek by Thursday. Henry Marsh told her this when she collected her mail, with a careful neutrality that matched Mrs. Gallagher's, and told her that the entire town had opinions about this sequence of events that they were, out of respect and affection for her, keeping to themselves. She appreciated this. She thanked Henry Marsh sincerely. October deepened into November and the land changed, the grasses going gold and amber, the air sharpening, the mornings requiring a coat. Cora loved autumn in Texas in a way she had not anticipated, the bigness of the sky in fall light, the particular smell of wood smoke beginning to come from chimneys. She was fully settled now, fully herself in this place, and the school was going beautifully. Alice Henderson had moved through 2 levels of mathematics ahead of her age, and was starting on geography in a way that made her ask questions about the world that Cora found genuinely stimulating to answer. Bobby Marsh had made significant progress in reading, and regularly informed Cora of this progress himself, in case she had not noticed. Isaac called on her twice a week, always with purpose, always with something specific to do or discuss, which she understood was his way of establishing intention without pretension. He walked her to Sunday services and sat beside her in the church pew with a propriety that was evident to everyone and commented on by several people in ways she found charming. He brought her a book from the small personal library he kept at the ranch house, a well-worn copy of Thoreau's Walden with margins annotated in his careful handwriting, and this gift told her more about him than 6 conversations could have. She gave him back, after reading it, a copy of Jane Eyre, which she had carried in her trunk from Abilene because it was a book she could not have left behind, and she watched his face as he looked at it and wondered if he would understand why she had given it specifically. 3 weeks later he gave it back without comment and then said, quietly, "The part where she leaves is the bravest thing in the book." She had looked at him and thought, "You understood exactly." It was at the Thanksgiving gathering, held at the Abbott Ranch house, because it was the largest space available, and because Ernesto Ramos had declared that anyone who knew how to cook for 50 ranch hands could manage Thanksgiving dinner for 30 townspeople, which turned out to be true, that Isaac Abbott did something Cora did not anticipate. The gathering was loud and warm and full, the ranch house crowded with the families of Dusty Creek and the adjacent ranches, everyone contributing food, children underfoot, the smell of roasting turkey and cornbread and spiced cider doing fine work on the November air. Cora was helping Consuela Ramos set the dessert table when she heard the room go slightly quieter, and looked up to find Isaac standing in the center of it with a glass raised. He gave a toast. It was short, which was predictable, and it was about the community, about the families gathered, about the land and the work and the children growing up in it. And it was so quietly and genuinely eloquent that Mrs. Gallagher had to press her lips together, and Cora felt her throat tighten. And then he said, looking directly across the room at her with those dark, steady eyes, that some things arrive in your life when you least expect them and turn out to be the thing you most needed, and that he was grateful, and that was all. The room went very still for a moment, and then erupted in the approving commotion of 30 people who are all, to varying degrees, already convinced that something important is happening. And Cora stood by the dessert table and felt her face do things it was not going to be persuaded to stop. After dinner, when the gathering was winding down and children had been collected, and the older folks had settled into comfortable conversations by the fire, Isaac found her on the back porch of the ranch house where she had gone for 10 minutes of cool November air. He stood beside her and looked out at the night sky, which was extraordinary and unobstructed and full of more stars than the sky over Abilene had ever been able to produce. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want to ask it properly, not because I think ceremony is important, but because what I'm asking is." Cora turned to look at him. He was looking at the stars, and then he turned to look at her, and his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, open and serious and quiet and certain. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, and the garnet caught the light from the window and held it. "This was my mother's," he said. "I've been carrying it in my pocket since Tuesday. I should have asked you properly in the schoolroom, but I needed another day to be sure I was saying it right." "You're saying it correctly," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "Cora Carter," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had asked about her arrival twice because once was not enough, and who had built her bookshelves and given her annotated books and toasted her in front of 30 people with extraordinary brevity and complete sincerity. And she thought about the word real, which he had used the first time he told her anything true about what he felt, and she thought, "Yes, this is real." "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger with hands that were not quite steady either, and then he kissed her, and this kiss was nothing like the brief, careful first one in the schoolroom. It was complete and warm and full of everything they had both been holding back since a lantern-lit Saturday in October, when they had stood at the edge of something and looked across at each other across the distance. When they came back inside, Mrs. Gallagher took one look at Cora's left hand and sat down with an expression of profound satisfaction, and Ernesto Ramos shook Isaac's hand for a long time and said something in Spanish that Cora caught only part of, but the part she caught was something about it being about time. They were married in February, at the small Dusty Creek church, on a cold, bright day when the sky was the deep, cloudless blue of the Texas winter. The ceremony was attended by everyone in town and most of the surrounding ranching families. Cora wore a dress of deep green wool that Mrs. Gallagher had helped her make, which was far better than anything she could have afforded in Abilene, and carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers because wildflowers were important to her, and February did not offer fresh ones. Isaac wore his best suit and looked, Alice Henderson said afterward to Bobby Marsh, like he had just been told the best news of his entire life, which was more or less accurate. The wedding dinner was at the ranch house, which Consuela Ramos had decorated with extraordinary care, and the fiddle player Pete achieved on this occasion a level of musical skill that his previous performances had not suggested he possessed. People danced in the large front room until late, and Cora and Isaac danced too, something they had not done at the Henderson gathering because neither of them had been ready then, and dancing with him was like all the other things about him, apparently simple and extraordinarily complete. When the last guests had gone and the ranch house was quiet, Cora stood in the middle of the large front room looking at the life she had just formally chosen, At the stone fireplace and the tall bookshelves and the handmade furniture and the wide windows that in daylight showed the range stretching away in all directions. And Isaac came and stood beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned against him and felt, with a completeness she had not known she was looking for, entirely at home. Spring came, and with it the rhythms of ranch life in a season that is all urgency and renewal, the calving and the branding and the fencing and the planting of the kitchen garden, which Cora took over with the systematic enthusiasm she brought to all her projects. She was still teaching school, which had never been in question. Isaac had never suggested otherwise. The school was thriving, having now 20 children and 3 levels of learning, and Cora had written to 2 teacher training institutions in the Northeast requesting materials that might help her expand the curriculum. She had also, in a quiet act of initiative that she decided to inform Isaac about only after it was accomplished, written to the county government requesting that the Dusty Creek School be officially recognized and funded, which would mean a small allocation for additional supplies and a formal acknowledgement that the school existed. The county wrote back with a yes in May, and Isaac read the letter with an expression of such complete unsurprised satisfaction that she laughed out loud at him, and he said, very seriously, "I never doubted it," which was somehow both infuriating and exactly what she wanted to hear. In June, Cora told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen early in the morning before the ranch hands arrived and the day's work began, when the light was coming through the east window over the sink and the coffee was on the stove. She handed him his coffee and said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her across the table, steady and patient, and she saw in his face the specific quality of attention he always gave her, the full and serious giving of himself to what she was about to say. She told him. She watched him receive it. She watched the controlled composure do something she had never seen it do before, which was simply dissolve, not dramatically, not in any loud or externally notable way, just quietly gone, leaving behind his face showing exactly what he felt, which was joy of a kind so large and clean that it looked like something that had been waiting inside him for a long time. He was out of his chair and beside her before she had finished the sentence, and he held her with a completeness and a tenderness that made her eyes sting, and he said her name against her hair and nothing else, because nothing else was necessary. Their son was born in January of the following year, on a cold, clear night when the stars were exceptional. The ranch hands had been in a state of suppressed agitation since midday, and Isaac had been beside her through the labor with the same steady, focused presence he brought to everything, not hovering, not expressing his fear except in the tight set of his jaw, simply there, completely and reliably there. Mrs. Gallagher served as midwife with the authority of someone who has done this many times and intends to do it many more. The baby was healthy and loud, and had a great deal of dark hair and Isaac's serious dark eyes, which would have been funny if she had the composure to be amused by anything in the immediate aftermath of labor. Isaac held his son for the first time with a careful reverence that she had never seen anything surpass, large, capable hands cradling something so new and precious, and his face showing the full weight of it, love and responsibility and wonder in proportions that had no armor in front of them at all. They named him James, after Cora's father, which had been Isaac's suggestion, offered quietly and without pressure, and accepted immediately. James Abbott was a person from his first day in the world. He was curious and loud, and had opinions about most things before he could properly articulate them, which everyone who knew his mother found entirely predictable and entirely charming. Bobby Marsh, now 9 and a committed reader, visited the ranch the day after the birth with a small hand-carved wooden horse that he had made himself, or mostly made with some guidance from his father, and presented it to the baby with such solemn ceremony that Cora, still exhausted and tender from the birth, had to turn her face away to compose herself. Alice Henderson came to help in the house for 2 weeks after the birth, because she was now 16 and entirely capable of running a household, and also because she had appointed herself Cora's unofficial protector during the period when Dusty Creek had still been making up its mind about the new teacher, and she felt that this relationship had permanence. Alice was right about this. She was right about most things. Life arranged itself into a new shape, fuller and louder and more demanding and more complete. Cora returned to teaching in the autumn, bringing James to the school with her in a basket, where he spent his days in various states of consciousness, while 14 children conducted their education around him and took turns being distracted by his existence. This arrangement would not be permanent, but it worked for the year, and by the time the following autumn came, James was old enough to stay at the ranch in the mornings with Maria, Consuela's eldest daughter, who at 17 was delighted with the responsibility and excellent at it. Isaac and Cora had the evenings, after James was asleep and the ranch was quiet, and the stars were doing their extraordinary nightly performance through the bedroom window. These evenings were the shape of what she had meant, years ago in Abilene, when she had sat alone in her apartment thinking about something real. Reading together, him with his carefully annotated books, and her with whatever she was in the middle of, which was usually a minimum of 3 things at once. Talking about the ranch and the school and the children and the larger world, which was changing fast in 1884, with the railroad coming closer, and the cattle industry restructuring, and the territory expanding, all of it requiring thought and discussion, and the particular clarity that comes from talking with someone who hears you fully and thinks alongside you rather than at you. She loved him in a way that grew rather than diminished with time and proximity, which she had suspected was possible but had never had evidence for. She loved his silences, which she had learned to read with accuracy. She loved his occasional surprising humor, dry and specific, emerging without warning from conversations she had not expected it to arrive in. She loved the way he was with James, who adored him with a completeness that was both delightful and slightly intimidating to everyone around it. She loved the way he stood on the porch in the evening and looked out over the land he had kept and built and loved for 15 years, the expression of someone who is exactly where they are supposed to be. He told her periodically in the precise and careful way that was natural to him what he felt. He did not say it every day. He said it when he meant it fully, which made each time it happened land with the weight of something true rather than habitual. He told her she was the best thing he had not known he was waiting for. He told her once very quietly, after a particular Sunday evening when the light was right and James had just gone to sleep, and the world felt still and good, that he had been afraid for a long time that the life he was building would be complete in everything but the one thing that mattered most, and that she had resolved that fear so completely that he had trouble remembering what it had felt like. She knew what he meant. She had felt it too. The summer James turned 2, a letter arrived that required some thought. It was from a woman named Martha Cole, who was the head of a small women's education society in Austin, and who had apparently heard of the Dusty Creek School through the county office that had officially recognized it. She wrote to inquire whether Cora would be willing to come to Austin for a week to speak at their annual meeting about frontier education and the specific challenges and opportunities of teaching in isolated rural communities. Isaac read the letter when she handed it to him and was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You should go." "It's a week," she said. "I know, you should go." She looked at him. "James will be difficult. James will be fine. Maria adores him and he adores her, and Ernesto's boys will keep him occupied. He won't notice you're gone for at least the first 3 days." A pause. "I will notice immediately, but that's different." She went to Austin for a week in September of 1885, leaving James in excellent hands and Isaac in the slightly more complicated situation of a man who had become so accustomed to the particular quality of another person's presence that their absence registers as a physical change in the temperature of a house. She wrote to him every day, which she had promised herself she would do, and he wrote back, which she had not expected because writing was not his natural mode. But the letters she received were characteristically precise and unexpectedly beautiful, telling her about the ranch and about James and about the quality of the autumn light on the range, and in one of them simply this: "The house knows you're gone." She came home on a Saturday morning stage, and Isaac Abbott, who had sent her a letter from the ranch, was standing at the stage office when the stage pulled in, which meant he had ridden in from the ranch and been waiting. And when she stepped down from the stage with her traveling bag, he was simply there. And the way he looked at her when she stepped down was the same look she had first seen across the main street of Dusty Creek 2 years ago. The slight stillness, the controlled composure working hard. The thing behind it that was not controlled at all. James, who had apparently escaped from Maria sometime in the previous hour, was also there, because Bobby Marsh, now 10 and deeply unreliable as a keeper of secrets, had told him that his mother was coming home today. James ran across the stage yard and attached himself to her knees with the total commitment of a 2-year-old, and she picked him up and held him with one arm and looked over his dark head at Isaac and said, "Hello," and he said, "Hello." And the stage yard was full of people going about their business, and not one of them made the slightest effort to pretend they were not watching. That evening, after James was asleep and the ranch was quiet, Cora sat on the porch with Isaac and told him about Austin, about the women at the Education Society, about the conversations and the ideas she had brought back with her. And she told him about a proposal that had been made to her on the last day of the conference, which was that she consider writing a guide to frontier schooling that could be distributed to other rural teachers through the Society's network. It would take time, she said. I would have to do it alongside everything else. It would mean some evenings unavailable. You should do it, he said, without hesitation. You don't know what it involves yet. I know that you should do it, he said. Any idea you've had about whether I would support your work, you can put that away right now. I didn't marry a woman I intended to make smaller. She looked at him in the evening light and thought for the 20th time that she would never fully exhaust her supply of things to learn about him and feel grateful for. You're going to have to manage James solo on some evenings, she said. James and I have an excellent relationship, Isaac said. I'm not worried. She wrote the guide over the following 8 months, in the evenings after James was asleep and on Saturday mornings, and it was published by the Austin Women's Education Society in the spring of 1887 under the title Teaching on the Frontier, a practical guide for rural educators, and it was read by teachers in at least 4 other states within the year, which Cora found both gratifying and slightly overwhelming. Isaac received his copy with a solemnity she recognized as the external form of something much larger, and he put it on the shelf in the ranch house parlor in a position of particular prominence, next to his annotated Thoreau and her Jane Eyre, and this arrangement of 3 books told anyone who looked at it something complete and true about the shape of their lives together. The spring of 1887 also brought other changes. The railroad came through the county, 30 miles north of Dusty Creek, but close enough to change the economics of the cattle industry in ways that Isaac had been anticipating for 2 years and had already planned for. The town grew, slowly but noticeably, new families arriving, new businesses opening. A doctor settled permanently, which had been needed for years. A second general store. A small telegraph office that Mrs. Gallagher regarded with deep suspicion as an affront to the proper postal service. The school outgrew its building. This was something Cora had seen coming since the previous autumn and had been planning for. And when she presented Isaac with a detailed proposal for a 2-room expansion, he read it carefully and then took it to the county office himself, and spent 3 weeks negotiating county funding that, combined with his own contribution, built the expansion by summer. The new room allowed Cora to separate the older students from the younger ones, which improved the quality of instruction for both groups, and she wrote about the results in a letter to the Austin Society that they published in their quarterly journal. Bobby Marsh, 11 now and reading at the level of someone considerably older, came to her one afternoon after school had dismissed and told her that he wanted to be a teacher. He said this with the same solemn directness he had brought to his first assessment of her, 6 years earlier in her doorway, except now it had the weight of genuine aspiration behind it. Cora sat down at her desk and invited him to sit at his, the same desk he had occupied since his first day in her school, and they talked for an hour about what it meant to teach and what it required and what was possible, and she told him that he should consider applying, when the time came, to the normal school in Huntsville that trained teachers, and she would write him a letter that would get him in. Bobby Marsh left the school that afternoon carrying himself slightly differently than when he had arrived, and Cora sat for a moment in the quiet schoolroom and felt the particular satisfaction of a person doing the work they were made for. In the autumn of 1887, Cora discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Isaac in the evening after James was asleep, in the quiet ranch house with the lamp lit and his book on the table and hers beside it, and his response was different from the first time, no less large, but steadier, the joy without the shock of it, the certainty that this was right layered over the original wonder. James is going to be insufferable, he said, which was almost certainly true, James being at 3 the most opinionated small person Cora had ever encountered. He'll adjust, she said. He will. He's resilient. Isaac was quiet for a moment, his hand covering hers on the table. Are you happy? She looked at him in the lamplight, at this man she had known for 4 years and understood better every month and loved in a way that had never once felt like a trap or a forced choice or a dark secret, only like the truest thing in her life. Completely, she said. Good, he said, and brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to it, and this small gesture in the quiet lamplight was everything. Their daughter arrived in April of 1888, on a spring morning when the wildflowers were out in extraordinary numbers on the range, which Cora had decided to take as a good omen, and which she mentioned to Isaac while he was holding the newborn with the same careful reverence she had first seen with James, his large hands cradling this small new thing. They named her Helen, after Isaac's mother, which was Cora's suggestion, offered and received in the same simple way as his suggestion about James's name, 2 people who had understood from early on that their choices belonged equally to both of them. James, who was 3½ and had been prepared for this arrival with extensive care, met his sister with a suspicion that lasted approximately 6 hours, and then transformed into a proprietary devotion that was both extremely sweet and occasionally inconvenient. He had opinions about who was allowed to hold her and how, and wanted these opinions consulted. Ernesto Ramos told Isaac, at the branding in May, that the Abbott household had clearly produced the next generation's most determined individual, and Isaac said, with absolute sincerity, that he had no idea where James got it. Cora, who was within earshot, said, I have a theory, and the ranch hands within range spent the rest of the afternoon being considerably more cheerful than the hard work of branding season usually permitted. Life continued in the way of lives that are fundamentally right, which is to say it was full of small difficulties and large pleasures and steady growth and occasional beauty, so acute it required acknowledgement. The ranch expanded by another section in 1889, which Isaac had negotiated with a neighbor who was returning to Georgia, and the expansion was managed with the addition of 2 more permanent ranch hands, one of whom was the son of a family from Mexico who had settled in the county the previous year, and who turned out to be, Ernesto declared within a fortnight, the finest natural horseman he had ever seen. Cora's guide was in its 2nd printing. She had been invited to contribute an essay to a collection being assembled by a women's educational organization in Philadelphia, and she was working on it in the evenings with James and Helen asleep, and Isaac reading across the table from her, both of them in the particular companionable silence that is one of the finest gifts of a good marriage. Bobby Marsh applied to the normal school in Huntsville in 1890. Cora wrote him a letter that she knew was going to get him in because it was entirely and specifically true, which is the best kind of letter. He was accepted by return mail and left Dusty Creek in September with his mother crying on the boardwalk and his father shaking hands with everyone in reach. And Cora watched him go from the doorway of the school he had attended since he was 6 years old, and felt proud in a way that is its own complete reward, the pride of a teacher who has done the work properly. Alice Henderson, now 21, married Ernesto and Consuela Ramos's eldest son Louis in June of 1891, a development that had been visible to everyone in Dusty Creek for approximately 4 years, and that produced the most thoroughly attended wedding the town had seen since Cora and Isaac's own. Cora was asked to read at the ceremony, which she did from Corinthians, the passage about love being patient and kind, and she read it thinking about what those words had meant at different points in her life, the ways she had not understood them fully until she had lived some of them. The following year, James Abbott started school, in the building his mother ran, in the room where she had stood on her first day in Dusty Creek, and understood that this work was right for her. This development required a period of family negotiation regarding appropriate professional boundaries, because James had very clear opinions about the relationship between being someone's son and being someone's student, and Cora had equally clear opinions, and Isaac observed these negotiations from a position of complete private amusement and occasional necessary mediation. In the end, James Abbott turned out to be an excellent student who was determined that this fact would not be attributed to favoritism, which meant he worked harder than anyone else in the room, which meant he learned more, which was the best possible outcome. Mrs. Gallagher visited the ranch on Sundays with the regularity and comfort of a fixed celestial event, and she and Cora walked in the kitchen garden in the late Sunday mornings while the children were occupied, and Isaac was doing whatever Sunday morning thing he did that he claimed was necessary work, but she believed was mostly standing at the fence looking at the land with quiet appreciation. They talked about everything, Mrs. Gallagher and Cora, the town and the children and the school and the books Cora was reading, and the news in the Austin newspaper that arrived 2 days late by mail, and about larger things too, about women's education, and the changes coming in the territory, and the injustices of a system that had not yet found a way to treat all the children in the county with equal regard regardless of whose children they were, which was something Cora had been writing about in her essays and intending to act on with more directness. She had, in the 5 years she had been teaching in Dusty Creek, made certain deliberate choices about her school. Every child was welcome. The Ramos children had always been there. The 2 children of a black family that had settled near the creek in 1886, the Freeman family, came to school from their first week in the county, and Cora had presented this as the obvious and unremarkable fact that it was, and the children of Dusty Creek had followed her lead, because children follow the lead of an adult they trust. This was not entirely without friction from outside the school. There were people in the county who had opinions about it, and some of those opinions were expressed to Cora directly. She met every such expression with the same calm specificity, which was that every child in her school had the right to be there, and she would not be discussing the matter further. Isaac had never been asked to defend this position because it was also his, expressed with even greater economy of words but equal clarity. When a man from a neighboring ranch had come to the Abbott Ranch in 1888 to voice a complaint, Isaac had listened to the full complaint in silence, which the man had clearly interpreted as consideration, and then said that the school was supported by his money and run by his wife and would continue to operate as she saw fit, and that he was welcome to leave his child out of it if he felt strongly, but that the school would not change. The man had left unsatisfied. His children had continued to attend because their mother had a more practical view of the situation than their father. Cora knew about this conversation only because Ernesto had told her. Isaac had not mentioned it. She had gone to find him that evening where he was working on the fence along the north pasture and told him what Ernesto had told her. He had continued working for a moment and then said, "I should have told you." "Yes, you should have," she agreed. "I didn't want to worry you." "I'm not worried. I'm grateful. And also I'm capable of handling my own battles if you would let me know when they happen." He had put down the fencing tool and looked at her with an expression she knew well, the one that contained an acknowledgement that she was right and a slight resistance to saying so immediately. And then he had said, "You're right," which she appreciated because he always got there eventually and the route was always honest. "We handle things together," she said. "That was the agreement." "Yes," he said. "I'll remember." He remembered. It was one of the constants of their marriage. This ongoing negotiation between his instinct to protect and her insistence on being equally present in all the significant events of their shared life. And the resolution was always the same: the recognition that two people who love each other properly give each other the full truth and trust the other to handle it. By 1893, Dusty Creek had grown enough to have a second teacher, a young man named Paul Webb who had come from the normal school in Huntsville with a letter of recommendation from Bobby Marsh, now a qualified teacher himself, working in a town 50 miles east. Paul Webb was earnest and willing and taught the lower school while Cora took the older students, and the arrangement was productive and collegial. James was 9 and had developed his father's focused intensity, applied to entirely different subjects, preferring mathematics and natural history to anything literary, though he would read anything Cora put in front of him with the stubborn thoroughness of someone who believes reading is a form of work and therefore must be approached seriously. Helen was 5, starting school that autumn, with her father's dark eyes and something in her expression that was distinctly her own, a quality of observant patience that had been surprising adults since she was old enough to have preferences. Isaac Abbott at 42 was the same person Cora had met at 31, quieter in some ways, more fully himself in others, the land deeper in him and the family deeper in him, and the years of a life that had been genuinely lived showing in his face in a way she found more compelling than she had found the younger face, which had been handsome in a composed and unaware way. He still barely filled a thimble with his daily words in public, and he was still the person who could tell her more in 3 sentences than most people managed in an hour, and he still stood on the porch some evenings and looked out at the land with the expression of someone who knows exactly where they are and is glad of it. She found him there one October evening in 1893, on the porch in the last of the light, James inside doing his arithmetic and Helen already asleep, the ranch house warm behind them and the range golden in the autumn dusk. She brought 2 cups of coffee and gave him one and stood beside him and looked out at the same view he was looking at. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was genuinely considering the question rather than the way that meant he was choosing not to answer. Then he said, "I'm thinking that I asked Henry Marsh about a stage schedule twice, and that single ridiculous thing is the reason any of this exists." She laughed, a full and genuine sound that went out into the evening air. "You could argue the advertisement is why any of this exists," she said. "I could," he agreed. "But I don't think the advertisement is why. I think the twice is why." She thought about this. About the Monday and the Thursday, and the admission that the first answer hadn't satisfied him, and what that had been, really, that restlessness, that inability to let a thing settle when the thing was important enough to be unsettled by. It was the most telling thing anyone had ever done about her before they knew her, and she had known from the moment she heard it that it meant something she was going to have to reckon with. "The twice," she agreed. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the land stretched away from them in the evening light, and somewhere inside the warm house James was doing his arithmetic and Helen was asleep, and the stars were beginning to come out overhead with their extraordinary nightly abundance. "Cora," he said. "Isaac," she said, "I love you." "I know," she said. "I love you too." The stars came out fully, and the evening settled around them, and the ranch house was warm and lit behind them, and the land that they had chosen and the life they had built and the people they had become inside it were all of a piece, all real, all exactly what they were supposed to be. And nobody had told her on that August afternoon when she stepped off the Dusty Creek stage with 2 battered trunks and a letter tucked in her bodice that any of this was waiting for her. Nobody had said, "The quiet rancher has been asking about you." Nobody had said, "Pay attention to the twice." Nobody had prepared her for the particular quality of his silence, or the way he would look at her over the lantern light, or the way asking where she had been before Abilene would feel like being handed something true and given the chance to hand something true back. Nobody had told her. But the wildflowers on her desk on the very first day had told him everything he needed to know, and the twice had told her everything she needed to know, and the rest of it they had found out together, which was, she had come to understand, the only way that the finding out worth having ever happens. The stars were out in full now, and Isaac stood beside her on the porch of the ranch house they had made into a home, and the children were inside, and the land was all around them, and Cora Carter Abbott was exactly where she was supposed to be, which was the most complete and grateful feeling she had ever known.